Hey there, APUSHers. I hope you're all doing well. We are working through this e-learning. Hopefully going to be back in hybrid next week where we can be in person before we go home for the winter break. So, that'll give us an opportunity to have some sense of normalcy before we head off into winter break. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 15, Reconstruction. So this is going to wrap up our time period 5 and Unit 4. The Civil War era. This is gonna wrap up the notes there, and kind of culminate all of the events from chapter 11 to chapter 15. Setting the stage. Few periods in history create more bitterness and controversy than Reconstruction. We are literally putting the country back together, and that's not going to be an easy task. There's going to be a lot of disagreements. There's going to be a lot of different ideas, and it's not something that can happen overnight, and it's not something that's going to be easy to maintain, just because the differing ideologies of the North and the South aren't going to go away just because the war has ended and slaves have been freed. Okay, so when we look at the process of making peace at the end of the Civil War, it's going to be a very complicated one. For starters, Lincoln didn't feel that he could technically negotiate the end of the war because he didn't technically ever look at the Confederate States as a separate sovereign nation, because to him they were just rebel states. So it wasn't a matter of just signing a treaty and an armistice and calling the war over. So this was making things even more difficult than it already was going to be to rebuild the country. Also, the South was just completely devastated. When we talk about the infrastructure being destroyed, we think back to Sherman's March to Sea and how he kind of used that policy of scorched earth. And most of the fighting happened in the South. So, and you can see in the picture down here that it is just completely devastated and, war-torn. 258,000 Confederate soldiers died, and that isn't even counting then all of the Union soldiers who died in the fighting. So many families had to rebuild without their father figure or the males in their families. Many of the women from the South wore their mourning clothes. They wore black from head to toe for years after the war. We also have this idea of the myth of the lost cause. This kind of nostalgic, like what the South used to be idea. People missed it. People yearned for what the South used to be. And as a result, this is where we start to see the erection of many statues of generals and war heroes that were either, part of the war, killed in the war, all around the South, which is just, obviously if we fast forward to 2020, these statues are questioned and in the morality of them and what message they're sending, as many of these statues are representative of people who owned slaves, traded slaves, and were fully part of the process of slavery. We also then have 4 million freedmen that have to figure out their way. Many of them leave the plantation. They just roam the streets with the clothes on their backs, and they really don't know what to do, where to go. They are many times not literate. They don't know how to really function in society outside of their plantation. Here's some images that will, kind of show the praise that's given to some of the different, we've got President Jefferson Davis, we've got Robert E. Lee. Here's some of the towns that have been completely destroyed. Here's another memorial for the Civil War. So, these things are all going to be used to kind of commemorate the South and the Confederacy. Okay, so one of the biggest problems that the country is facing is what is the South going to look like with millions of freed black men and women, children, etc.? What will freedom look like for former slaves? There's a lot of different ideas. Even slaves had differing ideas. Some slaves wanted full ownership of the lands they tended to. They believed if we worked on this land for decades and families, hundreds of years, that land should belong to us. Other slaves just simply wanted legal equality. That would mean just the right to vote and protection under the Constitution. Obviously all former slaves wanted independence from white control. Nobody wanted to remain in slavery and bondage, but so that was kind of a unanimous idea. And what we see is that a lot of autonomous black communities are created throughout the South. What that means is like all black communities, which when it comes to gaining legal equality, this is where we'll see a couple influential black people become part of the government because of the voting that's taking place in these areas is all black voters. As a result of this desire to help blacks get into society and assimilate into society and become, influential in society, the federal government sets up what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a super important concept here. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a federal organization, so that means the national government has set this up. Federal troops are sent to the South to protect the freedmen. Some of the different things they did, they set up schools, they helped the freedmen settle onto new land. They did also help some poor whites just for helping to boost the Southern economy. And then they distributed food, helped people find jobs, things like that in the South. But this was by no means a permanent solution. And we'll see, the emphasis on the Freedmen's Bureau kind of waver as the years continue through Reconstruction. Okay, so we're looking at different ideas of how the South is going to be kind of brought back into the Union. And there were very partisan views that separated the federal government, which means that we see people with different views all over the place. For example, the Northern Republicans, so those are your Lincolns, feared the economic development plans during the war would be hindered by the new renewed Democratic majority. So all of the progress that was made during the war, they feared that progress would be hindered or slowed by all of these new Democrats coming into back into the federal government. Some of the other issues of Reconstruction and different faction groups that we can see here, conservative and radical Republicans. So conservatives supported the abolition of slavery, but they had very few terms for readmission of the southern states back into the Union. So it'd be very easy to bring the southern states back in if you were in this idea of conservatives. The radicals, on the other hand, wanted to make it much more difficult for the South to rejoin the Union. So they thought the land of the rich Southerners should be seized and be given to the freedmen. They believed that military leaders in the South should be punished, some even as far as given the death penalty. That's the belief. Southern whites, they believed if you seceded from the Union, you should be disenfranchised, which means they would take away your right to vote if you had willingly left the Union. Then we have the legal rights of freedmen protected by law. And, some of these radicals definitely were fighting, too, for the freedmen to get the right to vote. And then you have the moderates who are kind of in the middle, wavering back and forth on each of these plans. So the Reconstruction plans kind of boiled down to one between Lincoln and one that's called the Wade-Davis bill that's going to be a little harsher on the South. So Lincoln realizes that his goal, and it has been since 1860 and his inauguration in 61, is that he wants to keep the Union together. That's always been his top goal. So the 10% plan that he comes up with for Reconstruction is going to make it fairly easy to admit back into the South back into the Union. So the 10% plan grants general amnesty to white Southerners, which means that relieves them of any sort of amnesty is a large group pardon, so it pardons them of any crime. Aside from high-ranking Confederate officials are obviously going to be punished a little harsher than your average Confederate soldier. What he says is that 10% of voters must take an oath to the Union and support it, and then loyalists can create a state government that can then apply for statehood and rejoin the Union. Lincoln hoped that these states would be extended suffrage to freedmen. So that means that black men would be able to vote. Some of these came with conditions, but in general, black men would be able to vote. Under this plan, by 1864, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee became states again. This is prior to Lincoln's assassination. In response to Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction and readmission into the Union, we have what's called the Wade-Davis Bill that was made up by members of Congress. What they suggested is that the president would appoint provisional governors to each state. The majority of white males, so over 50%, would have to pledge allegiance to the Union, where in Lincoln's plan it was only 10. Then, at that time, the governor could call a state constitutional convention, where delegates had to swear that they never fought against the Union, and then they would be able to rejoin. Those state governments had to abolish slavery, take away the right to vote for all Confederate leaders, and they said they did not have to pay back the debts taken on by the Confederate States of America. So, the South had to build and maintain their army, which was expensive. And that leads to the war debt and lingering. Who's going to pay that war debt from the South if they're not part of this? If they're not the South anymore? Lincoln vetoes this Wade-Davis bill, but he does know there needs to be a compromise. Unfortunately, something happens in the meantime. As many of us know, Lincoln is assassinated on April 14th, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Perhaps if you went to D.C. on your 8th grade trip, you would have visited. I don't know if you guys went to D.C. or not. Anyways, John Wilkes Booth was a prominent actor and supporter of the Southern cause. Some believe that it was part of a larger conspiracy, but eventually, he was cornered and killed weeks after the assassination in a barn. Some militant Republicans believe that John Wilkes Booth was part of this larger Southern conspiracy, but Lincoln was no stranger to assassination attempts. He had a drawer in the White House in the Oval Office just full of letters that were pledging to assassinate him. Here's a couple of images from, you've got John Wilkes Booth's gun up here. You've got the funeral procession for Lincoln. And then a little bit of background information on Mary Todd Lincoln, who was Abraham Lincoln's wife. Okay, so when the president dies, the vice president takes over. In this case, the new president of the United States is Andrew Johnson. It's important to note that Lincoln had chosen Johnson as his running mate because he did have sympathies towards the South, and he thought that would help in bringing the South back to the Union as the war progressed on. So, Andrew Johnson, his personality, he was a little tactless, meaning like he kind of acted on emotion rather than thinking through his actions, which is the complete opposite of Abraham Lincoln. And he was intemperate, which means he had an attitude, and he was a Democrat. So this is just a reminder that this is the Republican Party we're talking about. And Johnson was a Democrat up until the 1860 election, when he did not want to secede from the Union. He was the only U.S. senator from the South to stay loyal to the Union, so that spoke to his loyalties and why one of the reasons why Lincoln chose him as his running mate. He openly resented the freedmen. The freed blacks in the South, which was obviously going to be problematic with Reconstruction. And he did not support the Freedmen's Bureau or other programs that were supporting the freedmen in the South. He offered amnesty to Southerners who claimed the allegiance to the Union in Restoration. Any Southerner who owned $20,000 of land or was a high-ranking official had to apply directly to the president to gain personal pardon. But if you think back to the fact that he's a Democrat, Johnson, and against the freedmen, it's probably going to be pretty likely that they'll be granted this pardon. Northern attitudes do, as through this process, harden. The radical Republicans refused to recognize Southern states under Johnson's plan. That seems too lenient to them. Some states were even reluctant to abolish slavery, which just at this point is, seems unfathomable. None of the Southern states gave African Americans suffrage in their state constitutional conventions, and many Southern states wanted to put the recent Confederates leaders into political power, which again seems unfathomable at this point. So kind of shifting back to the Reconstruction and what the South is going to look like, that leads us to what are called the Black Codes. And these were like state laws that gave whites tons of power over blacks in the South. So these laws, these laws were, some examples of these laws would be unemployed freedmen faced like all sorts of like charges and fines if they couldn't show up for work. They would be hired out by private employees and forced to work certain jobs. Some states forbid freedmen from owning farms, and they could only work in agriculture or domestic servants, agriculture as sharecroppers. Johnson starts vetoing a lot of congressional acts. For example, Congress reacted to Johnson becoming president by extending the Freedmen's Bureau for another year. Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act in 1866, which was huge, allowing the federal government to intervene in state affairs, which means if they're not carrying out ideas or laws in the South, the federal government can intervene to protect the rights of U.S. citizens, which would be all freedmen, once the 14th Amendment passes. And then Johnson vetoes all of these bills, but this is one of the few times in history where Congress overrode the presidential vetoes, showing the weakness of Johnson, truly showing the weakness of Johnson. So speaking of citizenship, it's important to know that the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to slaves. It says that all U.S. citizens will have equal protection under the law. Now, we know in hindsight, which is 2020, that this is not the case for many years and even still today. So the final Reconstruction idea that's kind of settled on is what's called the Congressional Plan. And this was part of 3 Reconstruction bills by 1867. So this was passed over Johnson's vetoes, and what it does is it creates 5 military districts in 10 of the former Confederate States of America. A military governor was set up to ensure that black male suffrage was carried out, and that the only white males who were not Confederates only white males who could vote were not Confederates. You also, under the Congressional Plan, had to ratify the 14th Amendment, giving all slaves citizenship and equal protection under the law, freedmen, And by 1817, all former states then were back in the Union. But wait, there's more. The 15th Amendment is also ratified. It forbids states and the federal government from denying the vote based on basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which you can tell, obviously still an important piece missing there is gender, but we will get there by the 1920s, which seems unfathomable 100 years ago. To fight Johnson, the Congress also passed the what's called Office of Tenure Act to challenge his actions, which is about hiring and firing federal officials. So with that being said, the Tenure of Office Act is what led to the impeachment of President Johnson. So what this act does is it forbids the president from removing senior officials, including members of their own cabinet, which they should be able to do. They also passed the Command of the Army Act, which the president couldn't issue military orders except through General Grant, who could not be removed without Senate approval. So it basically maintained power in the military and took power away from the executive branch. Congress ensured that court cases involving Reconstruction would be tried in civil courts, giving them jurisdiction. And the moral of the story here is that the radical Republicans had it out for Johnson, and Johnson is going to end up ultimately breaking the Tenure of Office Act. So they tried to impeach Johnson on the grounds of breaking the Tenure Act when he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, which without going through getting congressional approval. The House impeached Johnson. However, the Senate voted 35-19 in his acquittal, which didn't mean the 2/3 vote necessary to impeach him. Much like Trump's impeachment a couple of months ago, where he was impeached in the House and he was not impeached in the Senate. Here's a map explaining the dates that states were reestablished in the Union. Okay, as for how the South looked during Reconstruction, we're going to see a couple of different groups in the South that were important. Starting with, we have Southern white Republicans. So these are people from Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, that lived in the South. A lot of former Whigs who supported the economic growth of the South were down there. We have a lot of backcountry Southerners who were against slavery and never really for the war. And they voted with blacks to control some states. So we do see, like over there on the right, the Louisiana Constitutional Convention of 1868 was all black representatives. Those were scallywags. Sorry, I forgot to say their names. Scallywags are Southern white Republicans. We then have carpetbaggers. These were people who traveled from the north to the south. They're called carpetbaggers because they had all of their belongings in bags that were made of rugs, carpets. These were white Republican Northerners who moved to the South for new economic opportunity after the war. So they said, oh my gosh, well, they're going to be rebuilding. There's going to be lots of jobs available and they're going to need help. So they tried to capitalize on this economic opportunity. Then you also have the freedmen, who are your former slaves who got involved in Southern politics, mostly for the Republican Party. Many ran for office in southern states and in Congress. Reconstruction governments were full of both political corruption and graft, but we did see some positive public change in the sense that there were freedmen serving in government at all different levels. Education in the South is probably one of the most celebrated accomplishments. Obviously, it was illegal through slave codes to educate slaves in most states. So education spread throughout the South for both blacks and whites. However, it was not the best education by any stretch of the imagination. The Freedmen's Bureau and other Northerners moved to the South to become teachers. Some Southerners feared educating freed blacks would give them this false sense of hope or equality, and were against this new wave of education. Almost immediately, the schools set up in the South were segregated schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was meant to integrate schools, but that provision was taken away before the bill passed, so it did not require the integration of schools. So we had separate schools. Schools remained to be almost completely segregated into the turn of the century. Land ownership and tenancy. We did see failure to redistribute the land, but the idea of 40 acres and a mule never really materialized and remained kind of just a laughingstock of the South and the slaves there. Most slaves did become sharecroppers. Most freedmen worked the land that they had worked on before, but they now just get a little bit of compensation and money for their work. And they worked as sharecroppers, doing almost the same thing they did in slavery. All right, so again, during the South, we see income is going to increase about 50% among freedmen. This is huge, but that is obvious because most freedmen had nothing before. However, the overall economy of the South suffered greatly after the war. If you think about how destroyed everything was. The per capita income for slaves was not high enough for many of them to be even remotely lifted out of poverty in the South, meaning that they're freed, but they are still suffering from great poverty. We see something called the cropline system set up. This is a new system of credit in the South. It's centered around what are called country stores. These are like little markets, if you will, like these little mini markets. The farmers relied on credit to buy goods from these stores, and there was just not a lot of competition in the stores. So there was, prices were really high, and interest rates were high as well on this credit. So the merchants would basically give a claim on the farmer's crop. They would say, okay, we're going to buy X amount of your crop. So if the farmer had a bad year, they would then be in debt. So this was kind of trying to protect the Southern economy. We also are going to see the African-American family and freedom, changing gender roles. Freed slaves quickly took to the defined gender roles. Women cared for the family, cooked and cleaned, which was opposite of their lives in Africa and the matrilineal societies we saw in Africa. Most black women did have to take a job. A lot of them were domestic servants or working in the fields or doing laundry, but they were all very tedious tasks. So you can see over in the right-hand corner, too, some of the negative impacts of the cropline system. African Americans quickly lost the land that they had gained because of war debt. They had to almost just give it back because they couldn't maintain it. It created a one-crop system, which is really dangerous. You really need, in order to have a successful economy, a diverse economy. And if you have a one-crop system, it's like very much limited on how does that crop do each year. And then the overproduction of crops was going to exhaust the soil and just make it harder to produce good crops. All right, so after Johnson is going to kind of fizzle out his presidency, we're going to see the winner of the next presidency is Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Republican. He wins election in 1868. He was the soldier president. He had no political background. He's one of 3 presidents to have no political background. You have Eisenhower, Grant, and Donald Trump. Grant's administration was very inexperienced and clumsy, unfortunately for him. He relied on party leaders, and he used a lot of patronage, which was giving positions in the government to his friends. He was a strong proponent of radical Reconstruction, which makes sense as he fought on the side of the Union during the war. And he starts to see a faction form in the Republican Party of more liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, and he was a famous newspaper article. And the liberals and Democrats joined forces to try to defeat Grant in 1872, even though he was still victorious. He won the popular vote and 286 electoral votes. As we all know, we need to have 270 to win after this crazy election this year. Some of the big scandals that plagued Grant's administration actually had nothing to do with slavery or Reconstruction, but really was about the corruption in his federal branch, in his kind of posse. The first thing was the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Credit Mobilier construction company used basically what they were doing is that they charged companies 3 times the actual cost for materials and labor, and they were using what's called kickbacks. So any of that extra money that they overcharged, they would just put into their pockets. And they would pocket the excess money or cash and ultimately pay off all of their stockholders. But the problem here, and why this became an issue for Grant, is that many of those stockholders were in Congress. So the congressional members of the Republican Party here were taking kickbacks from this Credit Mobilier company. They also called many of his officials the whiskey ring. They were evading their taxes, and they were, many of Grant's officials knew about this, and they didn't do anything about it. We also have the Secretary of War, Belknap, who accepted bribes to keep an Indian post trader in office that wasn't supposed to stay in office. This was all kind of known as a Grantism, and the Grantism was the corruption of his tenure. Here is a political cartoon about Grant and his trapeze artist. He's got all of these guys kind of acting funny and acting a fool down here, and he's in control. Okay, so another big issue that comes up during the Reconstruction period is money. And that's because we have the Panic of 1873. So this panic began with the failure of a big bank, which is actually the opposite of what usually happens. Depressions and panics usually start out in state, small farm banks, but this time it was the big bank. Debtors, people who owed money, wanted greenbacks issued to pay off war bonds. And Grant opposes this. He wants money backed by gold and silver. The Republican Congress replaces old greenbacks with gold-backed currency, which makes it less money in circulation and the value of the money go up. Gold-based currency could not be really used all that often. So the more currency would help debtors. Gold helps creditors. So, this created a big issue. People who owed money wanted greenbacks. People who were collecting money wanted gold standard. And this is going to create another divide between the Democrats and the Republicans. There even is a national greenback party that forms, a minor third party that was active for 3 elections, trying to keep the money issue alive in America and talking about greenbacks. Another exciting part of this time period was Seward's Folly. One of Grant's successes, William Seward, purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million and also annexes Midway Island, which we'll talk about more during World War II, in the Pacific. So the Secretary of State, Fish, also gets Britain to express regret in arbitration for selling ships to the Confederate States of America and is going to kind of gain some popularity there. Here's where things start to change. So the North starts to become, as Reconstruction progresses, the North starts to become more preoccupied with their own issues, and the interest in Reconstruction is decreasing, which means that people just don't care as much about what's going on in the South because it kind of becomes like what we call old news. We start to see a lot of Southern states redeemed. We're starting to see more Confederate leaders put into positions of power, and then we see the first occurrence of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, in 1866. This is just 1 year after the war ends. What the KKK does is they use intimidation to keep blacks from voting or exercising citizenship, and really just from keeping blacks from existing in society. We also see economic subjugation as a means of suppressing their freedmen in the South, and this worked, a lot to just keep them from making money. The Ku Klux Klan Acts, the KKK Acts, the Enforcement Acts did allow the federal government to extend their power into state courts to ensure that any person who was discriminating against voting and citizenship would be punished or prosecuted. So the president could send federal troops in time of lawlessness, which is going to slow the KKK, and we'll see the decline of the KKK, and then obviously we'll see them come back later on. Here's the next presidential election after Grant. We're going to see Rutherford B. Hayes win the election barely. He won 184 electoral vote. You could see 185 to 184 in the process. Okay, so Northern commitment to Reconstruction was kind of fizzling. We start to see the impact of social Darwinism. Those who struggle financially are unfit to be successful, and people truly believe this, and they don't see a point in why or how this, many freedmen were affected by this idea. All Southern states had a Democratic majority at this time, and they were still being controlled by a military presence, which kept them from making too many changes. Now, here's where things really start to fizzle out with Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877. You really need to know the Compromise of 1877. This goes back to the election between Hayes, the Republican, and Tilden, the Democrat. They had to create a special electoral commission to choose the president because the race was so close, either at 270. Ultimately, Hayes does win, but the commission was made up of those who would, really support him. So what the Compromise of 1877 says, as a result of the filibuster to withdraw troops from the South, is that federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. They would appoint at least one Southerner to the Hayes' cabinet. There would be internal improvements in the South paid for by the federal government, and federal aid for the Texas and Pacific Railroad. So this was a huge win for the South, and it brought about the end of Reconstruction. The Republican failure in the South was very obvious. The goal was to implement some Republican economic policies in the South, and they failed. White Southerners were too upset about Reconstruction, so when the federal troops were gone, they Republicans were gone too. They just started to regress and go back to what they were doing before, which was really, a huge delay in progression. Okay, so the legacies of Reconstruction also super important here. We had some ideological limits, meaning Reconstruction was a failure on the basis of race because the Constitution limited leaders from taking too much control in the South because of all of the powers that were granted to the South through the 9th and 10th Amendments. There were limits on private property, and white supremacists felt that African Americans were inherently inferior and always struggled to give them the power that they needed to be successful. Social Darwinists also hurt the efforts from both the North and the South, who just simply saw the black race as being inferior. Now, the 14th and 15th Amendments were a huge victory for African Americans, and 13th, obviously, too. So we have 13th Amendment frees the slaves, 14 grants them citizenship, 15 is going to give all men the right to vote. And this would serve as the basis for Second Reconstruction almost 100 years later in the mid-1900s. The Redeemers in the South, these are people that were the Southern aristocrats during Chapter 11. If we go back, many Southern governments were now able to see new leadership from merchants and industrialists and ambitious planters. That's the Bourbon Rule. State governments in the South, they lowered taxes, cut spending, took away almost all Reconstruction programs like schools, and began to redeem the Old South. That myth of the lost cause is now going away. But the readjuster challenge did create some problems. They wanted more money to be available to state services. They pushed for greenbacks and debt relief and economic reforms. And these groups were more Republican than the Redeemers that were much more Democrat. There was some industrialization of the New South. Henry Grady was an advocate for industrialization, but he struggled because more white Southerners moved forward with one foot in the past. They really wanted to maintain their agricultural lifestyle. Now, there was substantial growth in the textile and tobacco industries, but not enough to truly become industrial at this point. We do see some railroad development. The South was beginning to build tracks to sync with the North, which is going to help with economic development. And then we also see the convict lease system, which allowed ex-criminals to work for free, which was a bit of a problem. Tenants and sharecroppers, this was done by both black and white populations in the South. 70% of farmers in the South owned no land because they were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Here you can see the percentage of farms that were sharecropped and the number that are extremely high. African Americans in the New South, the black middle class does begin to emerge. Many former slaves became bankers and lawyers and doctors, and most of all teachers, especially in those autonomous black communities. Important people like Booker T. Washington are going to come on the scene, who creates the Tuskegee Institute. He believed in self-improvement, and gaining respect and equality would help to incorporate the importance of black lives into society. The Atlanta Compromise, this said that African Americans should show that they are prepared for the duties and responsibilities that come along with the 14th Amendment and citizenship. And, people like Booker T. Washington really focused on making sure that blacks were doing all the right things to be respected and accepted in society. But unfortunately, the New South is going to only create, new problems, and then problems that we still even know today. So Plessy v. Ferguson was passed in 1897, I believe. I can't remember the exact year, which deemed that all public places could be separate as long as they were equal. This is basically legitimizing and legalizing segregation in the South. It institutionalizes segregation in the South. This restricts the right to vote for blacks using things like poll taxes and literacy tests, and grandfather laws of if your father was a slave at this point, then you can't vote. And usually that was like 1863, where most blacks were still slaves. Jim Crow laws were passed. Jim Crow laws set up these legal laws of segregation. They created things like separate railroad cars, waiting rooms in restaurants, washrooms, theaters. They had no access to public parks, beaches, pools, picnic areas, or even hospitals at times. Many white mobs are also going to carry out a lot of lynchings. These were often people innocent of crimes. They had acted, might have done something a little off. And by the late 1800s, 187 people had been killed a year in lynchings. But generally, the white Southerners supported the suppression of African Americans. That was like kind of just a general mindset. And race and white supremacy was a very shared commitment of poor and rich alike. So the poor whites endured a burden, though, like economic issues, but they still believed that they were superior to the freedmen. And that was a quick overview of Chapter 15. Please let Mr. Blair or myself know if you have any questions.